Welcome back to Just Another Solar Podcast with Luke Beattie. That's me, Karl Jensen. G'day, Karl.
That's me, Luke. Welcome to my house here in the front room. I'm down the back room.
It's true. We could use one of those old school, a couple of tin cans and a bit of string. But to prevent echoing and whatever else and lag, we'll do it this way. And we're also joined by industry legend Nigel Morris. G'day, Nige.
G'day, fellas. Great to be back.
How did it go in my absence, mate? I wasn't on the last episode. You were guiding the ship. How was it, Nige?
Oh, it was great again. It's great to be totally in control again, mate. Hopefully you might drop off early because you got a plane to catch or something, and I'll get the reins again, mate. And I think Karl and I had a good time. You had some editing to do, I heard.
Maybe a little bit more than usual. And yes, I do have to get to the airport, but it's one of those. Do you know how ludicrous it is to fly from Perth to Melbourne for a single night? It's a lot.
Yeah, that's ludicrous. But good on you. Look at the commitment. It's no wonder we're changing the world.
We are changing the world, Nige.
We certainly are. I actually picked up on two things this week that made me think, geez, we're making a difference. Number one was average emissions intensity. South Australia has announced that their average emissions intensity is 230 kilograms of CO2 per megawatt hour. If I'm not mistaken, that's a 75%, more than 75% reduction. I think off air, Karl was saying it's 1,100 in Victoria a few years ago.
Was 1,100 in Victoria.
1,100.
I read that the East Coast is now 650, somewhere there.
Yep.
But 650 to 250 is a big drop.
It sure is. So South Australia has just demonstrated, what an absolute material difference, 75% reduction in emissions on average from the megawatt hour of energy into the NEM, which is just astounding. The other one I thought that was great was two things from Victoria, actually. The forward plan from Powercore, I think it was, has just been released. And there were two things in there that were interesting. Firstly, they said the solar tax is ludicrous. We're not doing that. Well, they didn't say it was ludicrous, just to be clear, but, that's what they meant. And really serves
That's the word of this episode, Nige. I dropped it and now you've got it. Perfect.
I love it. Well, it is. It's just ludicrous. So, Victoria said, nah, we're not doing that. That's a dumb thing to do. But more interestingly, I think, is that they announced that they're going to shorten the peak period from 3 till 9, which is very traditional sort of peak period in the NEM around the country, to 4 till 9. And again, the reason they gave is because of the penetration of renewables. So, that peak impact on the grid, which we all know has such a big impact on the costs of energy delivered. It's 0.5% of the year that those peak impacts really hit hard, and yet they're, a huge proportion of costs. So I look forward to the cost of network operation coming down as a consequence of the peak period reducing.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I noticed today, because Luke and I have been running around in the Tesla and I've still got to run him out to the airport. So I've got the car plugged in, and it was still showing -5 cents as being the network rate at 4 o'clock. It's just come back to 0 cents now. But, if it's -5 cents at 3 to 4 o'clock, then that makes absolute sense. You've got to tell people to use more power, and you do that by taking the peak period away.
Yeah, it's wild, isn't it?
I wanted to give a shout out to AC Solar Warehouse. I came over for one of their events last night, and it was one of the best ones I've been to. It wasn't end-on-end suppliers spruiking their wares, which there is a place for that. It's important for people to be across new products. Thomas Bywater spoke, and he brought up some interesting points, including that global production capacity of modules is 1.2 terawatts.
Ooh.
Global
terawatt mark. Wow.
Global sales of panels are 590 megawatts.
Oh.
Gigawatts.
Gigawatts. We're in the wrong market.
I mean, we don't even know what the conversion
590 gigawatts, or around double the production capacity. Phenomenal.
That's good and bad news, isn't it? There's a double-edged sword to having factories that can't sell half of what they make,
that need to pay off the development costs and construction and all the rest of it. The other interesting one, so Andy McCarthy doing the round still for his book, but he gave a really good speech, and as always, Andy's doing great things for the industry. Really interested to see where he goes next. And the quality of people that were there was great, and it was one of those events you leave feeling refreshed. So moving on, Nige, what else do you have on your list?
Mate, well, just a few reminders for people. only 17 days until the backstop rules kick in Victoria. You know, that's a big one because it means that Victoria finally catches up with the rest of the state. There's been a couple of good webinars. I watched one of those today. Dynamic is going to follow the backstop soon after, so it won't just be an on-off. It'll soon be a dynamic control. That's coming very soon. And, it's only 17 days away. So there's a lot of installers down there who've got to get their act together and work out what they're going to do to make all that work. And on the same 17 days, same date, 1st of October, the new PV module rules kick in. We've talked about them a lot of times on different episodes, but, that's coming up shortly. So make sure your solar modules are compliant with the new rules. Also wanted a big shout out to WA. I got to WA for a week, which was wonderful. Haven't been over for ages. Managed to catch up with the usual culprits and have a lovely time. And it just reminded me what a bizarre world WA is. The solar rules are strange, different to everywhere else, operate in a slightly different way and have some weird implications, but I got my head around it. Only 40 days till all energy, so there's a ton of work going on there. And just to keep it really interesting, big fat plug for Catch Power, who I work for. We finally launched our 6-channel multi-phase product after, 1,000 years of waiting. We've actually shipped devices. They're getting into stock now. But in classic style, we got to the nth moment of being ready to press the button, and I learned about a new feature that the guys just managed to slip in. So we now have 5 ways to communicate with devices and control devices, more importantly than just communicating. We're actually controlling devices. So we can now control air conditioners and orchestrate inverters, batteries, loads through a contactor, EV chargers through OCPP, and ACs through DRM control as well. So now we've got some really interesting stuff going on. So yeah, it was a big week for me.
All right, guys. So we've got another stellar guest as well. We've got Darren Johannesen from the SEC. Darren's involved in the product stewardship and the circular economy. So we know that the SEC's been working in conjunction with the Queensland government on their stewardship scheme. I know the headlines, but I don't know much about the details. And he's got a whole lot more to talk about. So welcome to the podcast, Darren.
Thanks very much, guys. Great to be here.
Congrats on everything that you guys have been doing with the Queensland government. And I believe it's been legislated there as well, which we'll get into in a sec. But for those who don't actually know what a stewardship scheme is or what they're doing in Queensland, do you want to give us a brief on that?
Yeah, no problems at all. Actually, language is really important in this conversation. So what we're doing in Queensland is a pilot, not a scheme. I'll explain that in a second. So actually, I often find that people don't fully understand what product stewardship is. And there's a lot of language that we use, like sustainability and product stewardship schemes and waste hierarchies and recycling, and how do they all interrelate? I think it's a good spot to start in trying to understand what we're doing by understanding what those definitions are, like really briefly. When we start with sustainability, we're talking about the big concepts of how do organizations operate within the ecosphere of the planet, right? So we're talking about, people talk about ESG. Product stewardship relates to how companies and the products that they produce, so it's the sustainability concepts and frameworks being applied just to the products themselves. So it's kind of like a tugboat with a ship. So the stewardship is when the ship enters the market, the tugboat sort of makes sure it gets in there safely. And the same thing with when the product comes to end of life. That's kind of product stewardship. Recycling fits in as a strategy underneath product stewardship, if that makes sense. The program that we're doing in Queensland is a pilot rather than a scheme. And the scheme tries to build a product stewardship program across a whole industry, like nationally, with multiple different companies involved, whereas a pilot is something small that asks questions of a market as a precursor to a scheme. So that's what we're doing in Queensland. So specifically in Queensland, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
So specifically in Queensland, what we're doing is we have 3 projects. We have what we call a small scale project, a large scale project, and a reuse project. All the projects kind of overlap, but what we're doing specifically in small scale is basically consumer energy solar module collection. So we're trying to work out what's the best way to get a few amount of modules from consumers' homes back to a consolidation point, back to a recycle. We're trying to understand the economics of that.
Capital cities, I imagine that's something that's easier to manage. But when you look at Queensland, it's huge. And there's
100%.
remote areas and hard to access areas. So I imagine logistics costs would be enormous for some of those.
100%. And so what the program's trying to do is look at 3 different zones. So we're looking at metro, regional, and remote, and building different solutions in those different areas to understand the logistics costs. In any of the stewardship schemes, the product stewardship schemes, nearly all the cost is associated with the logistics rather than the recycling. So, and it's particularly true for solar because it's very difficult, as you know, to move the products around cost effectively. One of the key things we're trying to do with these projects, with these pilots, is understand remote costs and regional costs so that we can better inform the development of the national scheme that the federal government is developing. Because there's another scheme in the market already, not in solar, in computers and TVs, called the NTCRS. And that scheme itself has had, it's been around for, I think, 13 years, it might be 14 years. One of the major criticisms of that scheme is that they never fully understood the logistics costs in regional and remote. And what we've seen is the collection and recovery ecosystem failing all the time. And so recyclers come in and out. They come in and say, yes, we're going to be in this market, and they go broke and drop out again because the costs were never fully covered by the scheme. So I think the federal government's learnt from that. And so one of the key questions they're asking of us is, please really fully understand these regional and remote costs, because if we get that wrong, that's a problem. So we're doing collections for consumer energy and large scale, and we're running a reuse project. The reuse project's got 3 parts. It's got a desk study part, so we're trying to understand the global research on the reuse of solar modules, decommissioned solar modules. We're doing a testing study, an independent testing study in conjunction with the CSIRO and Blue Tribe and PV Labs. We're testing 5,000 modules to see, what does the waste stream look like? What's the quality of the waste stream? And then we're sort of adding those 2 pieces of work together to come up with what we're calling a regulatory and policy framework. So it'll be a testing standard and a series of policies that will be applied or recommended to be applied in Queensland, but they'll obviously, of course, have ramifications for the national program as well.
The cost of solar modules, brand new ones at the current watt classes, is so low. I think it'd be very challenging to commercialise after the cost of testing, tagging, bringing it back out to the market. How would you be able to commercialise it so it's competitive against brand new product?
This is a really interesting conversation, which could take up the whole podcast. Believe me, for all the work I do, the reuse stuff is what people talk to me most about. And the reason that's the case, so in Queensland at the moment, there's 1.2 million solar modules decommissioned a year. Of that 1.2 million modules, roughly 800,000 of them are consolidated and shipped offshore. And in Queensland, it's worth about $48 million in exports. And for it's a big number, right? And for installers and some retailers who get paid for that, right? That acts as kind of like a subsidy, which we're estimating is about $15 million worth of subsidies in Queensland. So that's what installers get paid for the modules, right? So there's a lot going on in that market economically. But to your point, and your earlier point about, I wrote it down, 1.2 terawatts of capacity and selling, was that 590 gigawatts of modules actually being sold? So there's a 50% gap there roughly. So that's just going to lead to lower prices. So I agree with you. Over the long term, or even short term, reuse has got some challenges because of that problem, excess of supply. And what we're hearing globally is that many of the companies that wouldn't enter the African market for many reasons are now entering the African market. And that's going to put downward pressure on the prices for secondhand modules. And therefore that market will start to dry up. But
that's the other point, isn't it? That they also have access to these cheaper, newer modules.
100%.
So at the peak, I heard that a secondhand module was somewhere around $80 to $90 in Africa, and it's already collapsed from that. It's quite likely it's not going to be viable to actually ship them across and make enough money to cover even the shipping costs and all the effort to do that, right?
Yeah, and I think that's certainly where we see the market going. But there is another part of this conversation, and this is kind of technical. There are some challenges going forward with some of the key materials that we use within our industry, principally copper, but also silver. And as the demand on these resources increases, we'll start to see some supply chain bottlenecks. But I certainly see that happening sometime over the next 15 years. And it's within that context that having a reuse standard is really important. So you'll remember during COVID how the new car market, there were supply bottlenecks in that, and the second-hand market went off, and the second-hand car was more valuable than a new car, simply because you could get access to them. Having a reuse standard allows us to integrate second-hand modules back into the marketplace if there are supply-side constraints. Regardless of whether or not at the moment that downward cost pressure continues, at some point we could face supply chain bottlenecks. So it's important to have, for the renewable energy transition and for all our businesses to continue to grow, we need this sort of backstop.
We've had some really long conversations on the phone, Darren, and obviously I'm right into this stuff, and I love everything that you're doing. Obviously, you know more about it than everybody else in the industry put together, and it's quite inspiring that the Smart Energy Council has had the foresight to even have a position that does what it is that you do.
Thanks, Seth. Look, I must admit, I'm super excited about the work that I do, and very thankful to the SEC for giving me the opportunity and creating the opportunity to do the work. It's a really broad slate, and when I'm talking about trying to describe our work, I say that I work in the intersection between the renewables and the broader biosphere. So we often talk about product stewardship, but other things that I work on is biodiversity. I work on pollution, plastics problems, packaging problems. So the remit's actually super broad and super interesting work, and all those things are really important for the industry to understand what our obligations are, but also for social license. There are bad actors in the market, we understand this, that criticise our industry, sort of, in my view, make up all sorts of stories. It's incumbent on us to make sure that we have answers to these sort of silly stories, and we have sort of action plans to mitigate them.
How far along are we? How close are we to this all just being in place? You know, you've got a pilot program coming. It's going to take a little while, right?
It is, and it isn't. So it depends what's in place. There's a lot of good. There's more good news in this story than there is bad news. So I'll give you an example. 2 years ago, when we started working on this pilot project, there wasn't a recycler in Queensland. By the end of 2025, there'll be 9. That's a huge.
Wow, that's impressive. That's a big change.
Crazy.
And, we hear it from the other side, which is the people that buy or take away our secondhand modules. I think Luke was telling me the other day, we got one guy who's collected shitloads of modules, and how's business? And he says, "Oh, I've lost $120,000 this year because the cost of modules is now more than what I can sell them for." Hang on, hold on a minute. This is amazing. Obviously, his market for selling the second-hand panels was at least temporarily saturated.
So the good news is, coming back to your question, Nigel, there's a rapid growth in investment in a materials recovery ecosystem, right? And I'll explain in a second why that's so important. The other thing is, we're talking about a national stewardship scheme. Where is that at the moment?
Yeah, who does the responsibility sit with? It seems to me like it's more a national issue than a state one. So I still applaud the Queensland government for doing what they're doing. I know other state governments have been looking at this, but doesn't it ultimately sit with the federal government?
It's such a good point, right? Because if we look at the issues around CSIP and inverter control and load control across Australia, it's a dog's breakfast, and that's energy. So, it should be consistent nationally to allow everyone in the supply chain to leverage everything they can out of it. So
well, you can't. Otherwise, you end up with some states imposing levies, some states not, and piecemeal.
Exactly.
It is for the federal government to sort.
100%, we agree, and the federal government's working on it, right? So this is one of their priority wastes. And so they've put a lot of time and investment in trying to understand how to structure the scheme. So in Australia, we have 3 different types of schemes. So we have a voluntary scheme, a co-regulatory scheme, and a mandatory scheme. So the voluntary schemes is like batteries. You spoke about batteries before. Batteries is a voluntary scheme. And a good example of a mandatory scheme that's a state-based mandatory schemes are the CDS, the container deposit schemes, right? They're mandatory. Everybody has to participate in that, based on state-based legislation. And an example of the middle one is the co-regulatory ones is the National Television and Recycling Scheme. With the voluntary schemes, there's no legislation, so companies opt in. That's a problem because there are many companies that decide they're just not interested in doing the right thing. So they tend to work where there's a high concentration of manufacturers. And so if there's 3 or 4 or 5 manufacturers in the industry and they account for most of the waste, then they can basically set up a scheme and cover the waste nationally. And so it's voluntary, there's no regulation. But typically, industries have more than a couple of suppliers. And look at our industry, right? There's dozens and dozens of suppliers. And there's also informal routes of entry. So our suppliers might have a footprint on the ground, but there's grey imports that come in as well. So where does the responsibility lie for paying for the management of those waste streams? So that's where regulation makes a lot of sense. And so I think, and I don't want to put words into the federal government's mouth, but this is kind of where they're headed, I think, is that they'll be looking at a mandatory scheme for the solar market, which means any products that are manufactured or any products that are imported into the country will incur a levy. I'm not sure how they're going to structure that levy. It might be $1 a unit or $2 a unit or fixed price per unit, or it might be a percentage, it might be a per watt. I don't know what they're going to recommend, but it'll be based on each unit imported or weight imported. And so everybody will be liable. That money will be paid into a central scheme. A central fund. If it's a mandatory scheme, it's managed by the tax office, actually. Recyclers and collectors will be paid based on some kind of schedule, which is yet to be worked out. The reason that's interesting is that the only mandatory scheme in Australia is for oil. And the way the oil scheme works is that the recyclers are paid on the quality of their output, not on the volume of their output, and certainly not on the volume that they collect. So the NTCRS, you paid on weights collected, whereas the oils program, it's on the quality of the materials that are recovered. And
when you say oils, you mean cooking oils, engine oils,
engine oils particularly. Okay. Yeah. So when that scheme was founded, interestingly enough, none of the recyclers could produce the highest grade oils. And then over the journey, which I think is, again, about 15 years, over the journey, because of the certainty around the payments for better quality outcomes, processors invested in higher quality machinery, got much better quality outcomes. So that
great story.
It is a fantastic story. Yep, yeah. I agree. So they're looking to do that idea within our industry, and I think that's the right pathway to go. It's super important for us to have a materials recovery ecosystem. And I meant what I said earlier about supply chain constraints. So if you're close to the metals market, for example, you'll know that copper prices are rising rapidly at the moment. One of the reasons that they're rising is there's an excess of demand over supply, right? So at the moment, these are rough numbers, but each year we basically consume globally about 24 million tonnes of copper, and we manufacture just under that amount of copper, right? About 30% less than that. So we refine about 30% less than we consume. And the balance, that additional 30%, that comes through recycling. They call it materials from secondary resources. So globally...
No way, 30% of all the copper.
Yeah, and I think
doesn't surprise me in the least, mate. So at the end of the day, it's really simple, Nigel. If it's worth money, I'm going to pick it up and send it back. Right.
Well, aluminium. I mean, I know there's a lot of aluminium. How does that compare to copper?
Thank you for asking that question, and I should know the answer to that. It's much lower, but it's still much higher than, say, silver, for example.
Right, gotcha.
The reason that I raise it is the IEA. What they're saying is by 2035, we're going to need 39 million tonnes of copper a year globally, right? To produce the products that we're using, that we need for things other than a renewable energy transition, and to execute on the renewable energy transition. But the mines are producing less. They're producing less ore and lower grades, right? It's unlikely that we'll be able to open new mines to double the supply. So what the IEA is saying, our pathway forward to the renewable energy transition is through recycling. So this is why the SEC is so committed to this program, and we've been advocating for it for more than 6 years, is because of that problem. If we don't get a global materials recovery ecosystem active and operating efficiently, then we're going to have problems in executing on our CO2 decreases.
happened in Victoria maybe 10 years ago. They took down a lot of the overheads in the street. They replaced copper overheads with aluminium overheads. And I haven't seen it happen in Sydney. Sydney's still got a lot of copper in the overheads, and so has Adelaide. But I'm sure if the copper's worth 5 times more than the aluminium is, or whatever the maths looks like, then that pays for new infrastructure that also needs to happen for the electrification. We need more distributed energy in our local grids. We're upgrading with aluminium instead of copper.
I agree with you that aluminium is a good substitute, but the problem with aluminium, of course, is that it's much less conductive, so you need a lot more of it, and so it doesn't suit all circumstances. So copper is really important. And I just want to make one more note on this. I call it the battle of the big three. So the renewable energy transition needs a truckload of copper, but there are 2 new industries that are very keen on the copper supplies. One is AI data centers, and the other one is AI-enabled robotics. I'll finish this topic on this one number, right, which is an Elon Musk number. He says that the market size for AI-enabled robots, and you may have seen Tesla's AI-enabled robot, it's quite remarkable, right, is 94 million units a year. And that's why people are saying it's going to be a trillionaire, right, because they're doing very well in the development of that product. The average robot, right, humanoid robot, uses more than 2 kilos of copper per unit. So you just do the math. So that's why we have to really get efficient in this process, in the materials recovery process. That's why it's so important for us, because our demand for copper is insatiable. We don't have really good replacements for it.
I think you missed the memo, Darren. The new robots are made of liquid metal.
Oh, I might have missed the memo, but I can tell you from the. I can tell you.
Terminator 3 is the liquid metal guy.
I just hope, based on US politics, they don't want to eat cats and dogs, because that's going to be a bigger problem.
That's so funny.
Yeah, that was pretty funny.
The real pressing issues, Nige.
That's right.
The big issues, mate.
The big issues.
Yeah.
No, so very interesting. So we're looking at the cost of materials now, the cost of recovery now, and it's certainly not viable and would need more than $1 per panel to cover it.
Sure.
But looking at where everything is moving and the prices of copper and silver and that sort of thing, as you said, it's going to become more and more viable for that recovery process to. Do you think we're going to get to the point where the recovery process and recycling process and all of the logistics costs are going to be covered by the recovered materials?
I don't really know the answer to that question. What I know is that the product stewardship scheme will make sure that we do. The reason I don't really know the answer to that question is it's still a little bit vague nationally on what is the quality of the materials that are recovered out of the recyclers. I know you had the guys from PV Industries on there, fantastic guys, and they'll tell you that, right? They'll tell you that it's difficult to make a quid on the actual materials themselves. There are newer players, other players in the market who are banking on the fact that silver prices will go up, copper prices will go up, and it'll be very profitable. But even that doesn't cover the cost of logistics, particularly in Australia where the distances are so long. So I think there'll be a need for a product stewardship scheme to cover the cost of logistics. Whether or not we need to additionally top up the profits of the operating costs of the recyclers, I don't know. I think the federal government are doing a huge amount of work on that at the moment to make sure that we don't have a red cycle where there's a kind of a program and the recyclers go broke. They want to make sure that the scheme operates effectively. I mean, there's a new guy operating in Queensland called Pan Pacific Recycling. Their materials recovery is quite stunning. And also there's another group of guys in Sydney, Karl. Their materials recovery is heading down quite a remarkable pathway as well. So I think we're going to start to see true materials recovery and separation pretty quickly. And they're banking on that for their economic model.
What about the other components? So for mounting, it's typically aluminium or steel, and they both have mature recycling industries.
100% easy.
What about inverters, batteries? I mean, batteries as well. There's sort of some maturity around recycling there. Tell us. So you don't completely agree. The listeners can't see the look on your face. So I suppose I'm making a comment, but fishing or asking a question at the same time. What if we're truly going to have a circular economy within our industry? Then it takes in all the components that we're using. So what about inverters and batteries?
Just a point of policy from our perspective. We think that any stewardship scheme should apply to all the waste streams that arise within within the industry. So batteries, inverters, racking, cables, packaging, we should be responsible for our waste arising. That's our responsibility as an industry to do that. So just thinking about batteries and thinking about inverters, right? Because inverters are full of copper, they're kind of valuable. The recyclers are very happy to receive those. We're about to make some announcements on some programs in inverters, which I can't talk about yet, within our remit. But I'll talk about that a little bit later, maybe on another podcast.
You're not going to give us the scoop, Darren. We don't get the scoop. Oh my goodness! You just wave it in front of us.
Come on, just tell us.
Give us a hint. Come on, Darren.
Politics. Batteries are super interesting, right? Batteries has got some unique problems because of hazardous chemicals, because they're hazardous, right? To transport them around is really difficult. And in fact, we get a lot of member retailers ringing us to ask us about problems with batteries. So at the moment, we're actually doing a deep dive into the regulations for end-of-life batteries so that we can understand what's the best way, particularly around small-scale batteries, because there's a lot of regulations about how you collect them, how you transport them, how you consolidate them, which for the most part the market's unaware of. You have to have specialised transporters. You have to have special tickets and special conditions for consolidating them. So you can't just bring them back to in our solar pilot, we're bringing modules back to retail stores. It's not that easy to do that for batteries. They're treated differently. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to understand that better. Just thinking about the recycler ecosystem for batteries, like PV recycling, it's emergent. There are 2 or 3 key players in the space. I will also say it's attracting a lot of investment to expand rapidly. I think part of the challenge in that space is the change in battery chemistry going forward and the extent to which we shift to newer materials that are more common and therefore less valuable. That's going to cause challenges with how the scheme itself operates. So there's a lot to think about that. As it stands, there isn't a stewardship program for batteries, for battery energy storage systems, get my language right, or for large scale. It doesn't really exist. There are recyclers that will take those things, but there's not a scheme. I think there is some anxiety in the market that no scheme exists, and I think the federal government's looking at that.
So what's the ideal outcome? We've got the pilot. There'll likely be schemes which capture it all. What would be the best case scenario?
What do I want?
Yes. What do you want? What do you want, Darren?
I want it now. I want a national scheme that's a mandatory scheme. I'd like to see there be a single scheme administrator that accredits recyclers and collectors. I think that's a really good model because it allows for competition in collection and competition in recyclers. It also means that there's a single entity that receives the money, pays it out, and makes sure that that they are also responsible for auditing and checking the recovery rates and the quality of the recycling outcomes. By doing that, we can consolidate the waste streams, the materials, the recyclate, they call it, the stuff that is recycled that comes out the other end of the process. And if you can get consolidations, you can get better downstreams. We didn't really talk about glass. We started talking about aluminium and other waste streams. But to recycle the glass that we get from solar back into solar, we need a lot of it, and we need it consolidated so that we can afford to have investment into plants to reprocess that back into solar glass or back into some other glass, right? So at the moment, with it so diffuse and not much volumes of it, the economics don't make sense to put it through a process. So it ends up being downcycled into road base or or into concrete, which isn't particularly good because it's good material. My ideal outcome is a national scheme. I would expect that we would see that legislated within the timeframe of the next government. That's my expectation. They haven't told me that, but I would expect that that's the sort of timetable. So maybe 2026, something like that. We would see it standing up.
That's what you're dreaming, Darren. At the end of the day, Victoria doesn't have enough gas to get us through winter, and yet people are talking 2035, and we will have run out of gas 5 times over by then. So hoping that it's that close is probably unrealistic.
I think the legislation will be up and running and be ready to go. It'll be toward the end of 2026 when it stands up and starts operating. The reason that I'm it depends on the elections, of course, and who becomes government, who forms government. But the reason that I say it is that the department is a long way down the track with their thinking, and they're coming into this final round of consultation. So I'm as confident as I can be that they can do something relatively quickly. I trained to be a futurist is one of the things I trained to do. And there's a guy at the Institute, actually he's at the Singularity Institute now, but he was at the Institute for the Future. And he said, change takes longer than you think, but happens sooner than you expect. I think that's true of stewardship programs.
I think it's as straightforward as soon as those materials are worth more money as materials than they are as a scrap cost, then people will recover them and recycle them.
Sure. Yep. We're not at that point yet.
You mentioned being a futurist. Have you got any cool ideas or theories that you have?
No.
Sorry to go on a tangent, but
to be honest, my background's manufacturing. And in fact, 20 years ago, I raised $80 million to build a solar cell manufacturing plant here in Melbourne. That's kind of why I got interested in solar. And the reason I got into that is because I was at a lunch and Andrew Blakers from ANU sat next to me, and he was talking about sliver cell technology. You probably might remember that. And I said, wow, that's really interesting because making a sliver cell is the same as making a DVD. And at the time, I was on the board of a DVD manufacturing plant. And so I rang the owner up, who's a friend of mine, and said, I've got our new business. Let's make solar cells. That's how I got into solar. But I got into futurism because I was an entrepreneur. I started different businesses and stuff. And I went to do a master's in innovation and entrepreneurship at Swinney. And I found that interesting, but not exciting. And then next door to the School of Entrepreneurship is the school, it's not there anymore, but the School of Strategic Foresight. And I started doing electives in there, and I found that stuff really interesting. And it's through doing that sort of long-term futures work, which is that they give you tools and concepts and ideas to unpick the way you think about what might happen tomorrow and 10 years' time and 50 years' time. And when you start looking at that stuff, it's really interesting from a strategy point of view. And that's what I found really interesting. And as part of that work, I did a course on limits to growth. So you might remember in the 70s, there's a book that came out.
I was born in the 80s, Darren. But
oh, there you go. You don't remember. Anyway, so it was about that, and that started my interest in sustainability, and that's kind of how I fell into the work that I'm doing now, through thinking about those problems. And
how spot on with some of the ideas, like when it comes to energy, renewables. So were there any ideas during that time you were studying that were quite interesting and close to the mark?
Yeah, look, I think some of the things that are coming to roost is things like oil, right? The limits to growth talked a lot about peak oil, right? And if you Google how many years of oil we got left, it says 47 years. That's not long. And I often say to people who bitch about the renewable energy transition, we're going to have to do it anyway, 'cause soon enough we're going to run out of oil. And if you look at Art Berman's work or any of the oil futures people, there's no debate. It's coming. So we're going to have that problem. So Limits to Growth made a whole series of predictions about changes to the way the world might look based on consumption rates. And it was their modelling was redone by, I think, KPMG a couple of years ago. And basically they put all these different scenarios in place, and many of those scenarios are at play now. And one of the things they talked about is pollution, issues with pollution and productivity, issues with pollution and birth rates, a whole lot of stuff that they talked about, which are, problems that we're talking about every day today. Yeah, so there was a lot in that. But thinking about technology, right? I would have said AI enabled robotics. If I was young and I was going to start another career on 10 years ago, I would have started in robotics, because that's clearly the next, Wild West. It's going to be super interesting. And I encourage anyone to read. There was a report by Rethink X recently that, I don't know whether any of you guys read that report, but that's a really interesting report that talks about the shift that robotics will have on our economic system. And it's really worth a digest, because there's some really interesting complications that they might bring to bear in the way that our society works. I would say that the first thing futurists are taught is whatever you say is wrong. Like whatever your forecast is wrong. I get it wrong. Everybody gets it wrong. Limits to Growth got it wrong. And so it's really just about taking up lots of different data points and picking those data points and just trying to make sense from your perspective of what you think might happen. And that's certainly what I try to do. And certainly the work that I'm trying to do in stewardship, coming back to that, is trying to understand all the different data points that are all over the place and trying to chart a pathway through so that we can have the lowest cost. And when I say cost, I'm thinking not just the dollars and cents, the economic dollars and cents, but also the lowest environmental cost and the greatest materials recovery, so we have ongoing lower costs for the renewable energy transition. So bringing all these things together to try and form a view of what is possible, and then trying to tickle policymakers to think about, what's the right policy settings to make that happen. That's why I love working at the SEC. It's such amazing people, products, thinking that goes on, and the people that support us are fantastic. I'm very thankful.
How did you end up at the SEC?
I was working with one of the leading product stewardship operations companies, and it was a gift for me because I knew solar. I started working on solar back then, and so I started trying to agitate for a national scheme. This is how I got to know the SEC. I was working on, I think, 4 different proposals, might have been 5 different proposals over 6 years to try and stand a scheme up in different types of ways. One was a commercial kind of operation, which we were trying to work out with a whole lot of retailers to try and build a commercial stewardship, national voluntary commercial scheme. And then there was one which was an innovation call. I think there was an innovation grant that we all went for, and I think the SEC put in a bid, and we put in a bid, and CEC put in a bid, I think. And then out of that, I started working more closely with the SEC on that project. To be honest, there wasn't a lot of foresight in the market at that stage about the scale of the problem, and the only people that were really wanting to engage, because I'd spent a lot of time analysing this, right, was the SEC. In particular, it was Wayne Smith. He was like, this is a problem, how can we back you? So we worked together on a series of different attacks. Can we try this? Can we try that? Can we try this? Can we try that? And then finally we got Queensland across the line, because they're quite progressive, and they'd not got sick of waiting, but they wanted to get something started. And so I put forward a proposal for a very small pilot. It was one site in Townsville, trying to understand the effective landfill bans and different incentive schemes on installers. That's how it started. And then they expanded it because they wanted it to do it bigger, which is sort of what we've got now. And then when that came across the line, the best way for me, I have this very single focused goal about getting a national scheme up. For me, the best way to get that goal was to join the SEC, and Wayne and John had a conversation, and I joined the family.
Very good. Now, I'm guessing that you're a very busy person, certainly with the proposed scheme or the one that you're working on and a whole bunch of other stuff that you're doing. What advice could you give, or what do you do to keep your balance, to keep the ship sailing straight?
I'm seriously not the best person to ask that question, because I'm not very good at that. I start at 5 o'clock, if any of you are on my WhatsApp channel, and things start pumping out at about 5 o'clock. But normally what I do is I ride my bike. So I do have a car, but I don't use it that often. Yeah, so I ride my bike everywhere. And for me, that's like meditation, because you've got to concentrate on the road and concentrate on what's around you. And it means you sort of switch off from everything. So I find that really good. I do ride my bike on long distances. So I'll ride from Melbourne to Adelaide, or recently did San Francisco to LA.
Really?
Yeah, it's great.
How long does it take Melbourne to Adelaide?
I did it over 7 days. My average is about 140, 150 a day. I think I had a 200K day. I find it really, really relaxing to do something like that. And I do it typically by myself, but I just find it's quiet, and good time to think deeply about the problems that you're trying to work on. And then you get those aha moments. Like, why did I do that? Yeah, I love it. That ride from Kingston through to Meningie along the Coorong is incredible, and I encourage anyone to do it. It's not that hard. It's quite flat.
For a few years, we did the Macca 200 ride over here in Perth. It's a charity ride raising money for cancer research. Lots of solar companies have given generously. I think the total over those 3 years for our team, the PV Chain Gang, was over 110 grand we've raised. But the thing I found is that we would ride down to Mandurah, which is 110 Ks.
Yeah.
And then the way back is 90 Ks. You come up the coast.
Yeah.
Now, the legs get a little bit tired, but you can push through. I think it's the saddle that gets the worst. The second day, it feels like 40 grit sandpaper. Like, so I'm not asking how you have the fitness to get from Melbourne to Adelaide. I'm sure you can build that up, but certainly I'm asking. Never mind. I'll leave that question in the bank.
I better see.
We don't have time for much more. It's been a great conversation. So normally we just whip around and get some last comments from the group. So we might start with you, Nigel.
Sure. Well, since we're on the topic of, 40 grit on the backside, I'm going riding this weekend, actually, and I've been doing a lot of preps. I bought an air saddle for the Harley because we're doing a probably 800-900K loop if we're good. Depends on the weather. But I'm going away with 4 buddies, actually, all on electrics. So we're going to navigate the charging infrastructure. We're going to navigate the weather when there's a huge cold front coming up from the south at the moment. So that's going to hit us on Saturday night somewhere. So we'll make some decisions, I guess, sometime tomorrow. But it's Friday here now, 9 a.m. tomorrow. I'll be on the bike and got 800 or 1,000 Ks to get through. Good underpants is the key, I heard. So I got myself some good underpants. And adjusted the geometry on my bike as well. Set the handlebars, put the air seat on to give me a little bit more lift and open my legs up. And the rest of it's all down to, an aging half-erect body.
But there's a lot more surface area on a motorbike.
Oh, there is. I wouldn't do that. That's just ludicrous. Isn't that our word?
Yeah, that's our word of the day. And Karl, any comments on saddle area or
ludicrous being the word of the day, did give my boss and yourself a ludicrous launch in the Tesla today, which is always great fun. Obviously I don't do it every day. Well, actually I do, so no big deal for me, but it's always good to have passengers in the car go, well, damn. So that's I don't have any news other than the fact that you didn't bring over any good weather for me, Luke. And the weather is absolutely rubbish. It looks like it's not going to be any better for the weekend.
Well, I'm off to Perth shortly, and I think it's around 27 degrees and sunny, in case you were wondering. So, Darren Johannesen from the SEC, it's been great to have a chat. We'll keep the conversation going offline, but also in the future, it'd be great to get an update on what you're doing. Do you have any last comments before we wrap up?
Oh, just thank you very much. It was great to talk to you guys. I enjoyed it very much.
Good stuff. Well, thanks again. And thanks to you listeners. Keep bringing the feedback. We really appreciate that. And remember to click the subscribe or like button and share it around to anyone who get benefit. We'll catch you next time.